before the airplane ever touched the sky, before we could cross oceans in just hours, before clouds had trails of white lines drawn by machines, there were only dreams. Dreams of flying. For thousands of years, humans looked up at the birds soaring freely and wondered, what would it feel like to fly? Some dreamed, some tried, some fell. But two brothers long ago decided not to stop trying. Their names were Wilbur and Orville Wright, the inventors of the first successful airplane. It was the late 1800s, more than a century ago. There were no airplanes in the sky, no airports, no sound of engines above cities. If people wanted to travel far, they took ships across the sea or trains over the land. A trip that takes just a few hours today could take weeks back then. The world felt big and slow, and the idea of humans flying, it seemed almost like magic or a fairy tale. People had tried to build flying machines before, but every time they tried, their machines crashed. Some were shaped like birds, some had wings that flapped, but none stayed in the air. Still, the dream of flight lived on. In the small town of Dayton, Ohio, lived a quiet and creative family. The father, Milton Wright, was a preacher and a man of books. Their mother, Susan Wright, was clever with tools and machines. She could build toys, fix things, and make little inventions of her own. Milton and Susan had several children, but two of them, Wilbur and Orville, were different. They were thinkers, dreamers, and most of all, builders. Wilbur was the older one, calm, serious, and full of deep thoughts. Orville was younger, cheerful, quick, and full of ideas. Together, they were a perfect team. One day, when Wilbur was about 11 and Orville was 7, their father brought home a small toy. It was made of wood and paper. It had a stick, a rubber band, and 2 little wings. It was called a helicopter toy, designed by a French inventor named Alphonse Pénaud. Their father wound up the rubber band, let it go, and the toy flew into the air. It hovered for a moment and then gently floated back down. The boys were amazed. It was like magic. They played with it for hours until it broke, and then they tried to build their own. That small moment, that tiny flying toy, planted the first seed in their young minds. They didn't know it then, but that toy had changed their lives forever. As they grew older, Wilbur and Orville didn't lose that spark. They built kites. They built small machines that rolled, spun, and flew across rooms. They even started a little printing business when they were teenagers. Using old parts and their own cleverness, they built a printing press by hand, out of wood, scrap metal, and bits of machinery. They printed small newspapers and flyers for people in their town. The brothers were not rich, but they were smart, hardworking, and always curious. When bicycles became popular in America, the Wright brothers started another business, a bicycle shop. They repaired bikes, built their own models, and sold them. They learned how to balance, steer, and handle machines that moved with both precision and strength. They didn't know it yet, but fixing bicycles was secretly teaching them the skills they would need to build something far greater. One summer evening, Wilbur was reading a newspaper article about a famous German man named Otto Lilienthal. Lilienthal was known as the Flying Man. He had built gliders, big wings he could strap to his body and fly down small hills. He had flown more than 2,000 times. He proved that controlled flight was possible, even if just for a short while. But one day, in 1896, Lilienthal's glider crashed. He was badly hurt and soon passed away. His last words were said to be, "Sacrifices must be made." When Wilbur read that story, something inside him changed. He felt sadness, but also inspiration. He thought, If he could come so close to flying, maybe we can finish what he started. He shared the idea with Orville, and together, the brothers decided they would continue Lilienthal's dream. They would build a flying machine that truly worked. It started small, sketches, notes, and talks after work. Then it became experiments, designs, and ideas filling their shop. Wilbur and Orville didn't rush. They wanted to understand flight deeply. They studied birds, how they turned, how they tilted their wings. They read everything they could find about flight, books, reports, and papers by earlier inventors. But most of what they found didn't make sense. The numbers were wrong. The ideas didn't match what they saw in nature. So they decided to test everything themselves. They started by building kites and small gliders. They tested them in open fields near Dayton. They noticed that when they twisted the wings a little, the kite could turn smoothly. That was their first big discovery. Controlling flight wasn't just about power, it was about balance. They called this new idea wing warping. It meant twisting the wings slightly to control which side lifted or dropped. This was something no one had figured out before. To test it further, they decided they needed a place with strong winds and soft sand, somewhere they could fly safely without breaking their machines every time they crashed. And that's when they heard about a place called Kitty Hawk in North Carolina, a small, windy, sandy spot near the sea. They packed their tools, wood, cloth, and notebooks and began a journey that would change history forever. The year was 1900. Wilbur and Orville packed their tools, wooden frames, and rolls of canvas. They boarded a train, then a boat, and finally a small wagon that led to the lonely stretch of land called Kitty Hawk on the coast of North Carolina. Kitty Hawk was not a city. It wasn't even a busy town. It was mostly sand dunes, sea winds, and a few wooden houses scattered near the beach. But that's exactly why the brothers chose it. The wind blew strong and steady almost every day, and if they crashed, which they knew they would, the soft sand would help protect them and their glider. When they arrived, the locals were curious. Two quiet men from Ohio, with boxes full of wood, cloth, and strange tools, coming all this way just to fly? Some laughed kindly, some helped them carry things, but most simply watched and wondered what these two dreamers were trying to do. The brothers set up a small wooden camp near the sand dunes. They built a tent for sleeping and a little shed for their workshop. The air smelled of salt and seaweed. The sound of waves and wind filled the silence. There, in that lonely, beautiful place, they started building their first glider. It looked like a giant kite. Two wide wings covered in cloth, joined by wooden sticks and wires. It had no engine yet, no seats, just space for one of them to lie flat on their stomach and control the wings. They called it the 1900 glider. When it was ready, they carried it to the dunes and held it up against the wind. They tied ropes to it, tested balance, and took turns gliding short distances down the sandy slopes. Sometimes it lifted beautifully for a few seconds. Sometimes it crashed right away. But every flight, even the bad ones, taught them something new. Each evening, after their experiments, the brothers sat outside their tent, notebooks open, pencils in hand. They wrote down everything: how strong the wind was, how far the glider went, what went wrong, and what felt right. They watched the seagulls flying over the ocean. Wilbur would point and say, "See how they tilt their wings when they turn?" Orville nodded, sketching the movement. The birds weren't flapping wildly. They were gliding gracefully, letting the wind do most of the work. The brothers realized that if they could control the wings like the birds did, Smoothly and gently, they could make a flying machine that could be steered, not just lifted. That's when they started perfecting wing warping, the secret to controlling flight. The days at Kitty Hawk were hard. The wind was strong enough to knock a man over. Sand blew into their faces, their food, even their tools. Nights were cold and lonely. Sometimes storms tore down their tent. But the Wright brothers didn't give up. They repaired what was broken and tried again. Every mistake was a teacher. Their motto became, "Every time we fail forward." After weeks of testing, they realized the 1900 glider wasn't lifting as much as it should. The math from earlier inventors, the numbers they had used, didn't match reality. After weeks of testing, they realized the 1900 glider wasn't lifting as much as it should. The math from earlier inventors, the numbers they had used, didn't match reality. So they packed up their things, returned home to Dayton, and began building something new, something smarter. Back in their bicycle shop, surrounded by tools and grease, they built a wind tunnel, a small wooden box with a fan inside that could blow air over miniature wings. Yes, they built their own tiny science lab. They tested hundreds of wing shapes, carefully measuring which one lifted the most. Piece by piece, they found the truth about flight. Their experiments corrected many of the old errors from books and made the science of flight more accurate than ever before. This was one of the most important steps toward the airplane. In the summer of 1901, Wilbur and Orville returned to Kitty Hawk with a new and improved glider. This one was bigger, its wings wider and stronger. They hoped it would finally glide far and smooth. The locals smiled when they saw the brothers again. Some helped them carry the parts up the dunes. Everyone wanted to see the flying men try again. When the brothers launched the new glider, it did fly, but still not perfectly. Sometimes it lifted too sharply and dropped too quickly. Sometimes it spun out of control. Wilbur was frustrated. One night after a long day of crashes, he said, "Not even birds have to fight this hard to fly." But Orville smiled and replied, "Maybe that's why we'll do it, Wilbur, because it's hard." They didn't know it, but they were only 2 years away from changing the world forever. One day, a man named Octave Chanute, a respected engineer who studied flight, came to visit them at Kitty Hawk. He had been reading about the Wright brothers and their gliders. He wanted to see their work in person. Chanute was impressed. He saw their dedication, their careful notes, and their teamwork. He encouraged them not to give up. He said, "You boys are on the right path, more than you know." That encouragement meant the world to them. Sometimes all dreamers need is a little faith from someone who believes. By 1902, the brothers had improved almost everything: the shape of the wings, the frame, and the control system. They built their third glider, now including a movable rudder at the back, which helped steer left and right. This was the key. It gave them full control. They went back to Kitty Hawk once again. This time when Wilbur lay on the glider, the wind caught it just right. The wings curved, the rudder turned, and for the first time in human history, a machine stayed in the air while being fully controlled by a human. They could turn, climb, and glide smoothly. They could fly. It wasn't powered yet. No engine, no propeller, but it was a huge step forward. They had solved the hardest part of flight: control. Now only one challenge remained: power. One evening, after another long day of testing, the brothers sat by the campfire, watching the orange light flicker on the sand. They were tired, sunburned, and covered in salt and dust. Wilbur looked at Orville and said softly, "Do you really think we'll do it one day? A machine that can fly on its own?" Orville smiled, poked the fire with a stick, and said, "I don't think it. I know it." The two brothers laughed quietly under the starry night sky, not knowing that just a year later, their dream would finally take flight. After the success of their 1902 glider, Wilbur and Orville returned home to Dayton, Ohio, more determined than ever. They had done what no one else had. They had learned how to control flight. But now came the hardest part of all, finding a way to stay in the air without help from the wind. They needed power. But not just any power. They needed a machine light enough to lift into the air and strong enough to move forward against the wind. This was the start of their next big challenge, building the world's first powered airplane. At the time, engines were heavy, noisy, and used mostly in cars. Even the smallest ones were too heavy to lift off the ground. The Wright brothers needed an engine that was light, strong, and reliable. They looked everywhere for one. They wrote letters to engine makers asking for help, but everyone said the same thing: it's impossible. So they did what they always did best. They decided to build it themselves. In their small bicycle shop, surrounded by chains, gears, and tools, they began to design their own engine. They had a friend named Charlie Taylor, a skilled mechanic who worked with them. He helped them turn their ideas into real metal parts. Using steel, aluminum, and lots of patience, they built a small four-cylinder engine that weighed around 180 pounds and could produce 12 horsepower, just enough for flight. It was simple, but brilliant. Wilbur later said, "The power plant is simple, but it works." Now they had the engine. Next, they needed something to make the plane move forward, propellers. At first, they thought propellers worked like boat paddles, pushing against air like oars in water. But soon they realized it wasn't that simple. So they studied the problem from scratch. They spent weeks sketching, calculating, and testing different shapes. Then one night, as they talked late into the evening, it hit them. A propeller is really just a rotating wing. It had to create lift in a circular motion, not just push. No one had ever figured that out before. So they designed two large wooden propellers, curved perfectly to cut through the air and pull the plane forward. They carved them by hand out of laminated wood, sanding them smooth until they gleamed like polished sculpture. These would become the first airplane propellers in history. Now came the final step, building the machine that would carry all of this together. They called it the Flyer. It looked like their earlier glider, but with more structure and strength. It had two large wings stacked on top of each other, a design called a biplane. The wings were stretched with strong cotton fabric. The pilot would lie face down on the lower wing to reduce wind resistance. A small lever controlled the wing warping. The rudder at the back helped steer, and behind the pilot, the new engine and propellers would spin together, pushing the Flyer through the air. Every part was hand-built, from wood, wire, and cloth, using the same careful precision they used to fix bicycles. The Flyer was finally complete. In the autumn of 1903, Wilbur and Orville again packed their crates, their new engine, and their endless hope. They said goodbye to their family and set off to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, the place where their dream had grown wings. When they arrived, the cold ocean winds welcomed them back. The dunes were the same, the waves still roared, and the curious locals came to visit, smiling at the two determined brothers who had returned yet again. This time, however, they weren't gliding. They were planning to fly. The brothers rebuilt their small wooden shed and tent. They unpacked their tools, fixed up the frame, and carefully attached the engine. For weeks, they tested everything: the balance, the controls, and the engine's power. Sometimes, they would run alongside the plane as it moved on a wooden track they had built, trying to see how it lifted. The wind howled, the cold stung their hands, and the sand seemed to find its way into everything. But the brothers didn't stop. They adjusted, repaired, and tested again. By early December, the Flyer was ready. On December 14, 1903, Wilbur decided to try first. The Flyer was set at the top of a small hill. The wind was strong. Wilbur lay down on the plane, started the engine, and the propellers began to spin. The Flyer rolled down the wooden track and lifted off the ground for a few seconds,
before tilting and crashing into the sand. The front part broke, but Wilbur was fine. They pulled the plane back, fixed it carefully, and waited for better wind. 3 days later, on December 17, 1903, they decided to try again. The morning was freezing cold. Frost covered the dunes. The wind blew steadily at around 27 miles per hour. Wilbur and Orville stood beside their repaired flyer. They flipped a coin to decide who would fly. Orville won. A few local men from the nearby life-saving station came to watch. They helped carry the plane to the flat sand and set up the wooden launch track. One of them, John Daniels, brought a camera, the same one that would capture the most famous photograph in aviation history. Orville lay face down on the lower wing. Wilbur held one side steady. The engine roared to life, coughing, sputtering, then humming strong. The twin propellers spun. The flyer trembled. Wilbur ran beside the wing, steadying it as the plane rolled down the track, and then it lifted. The flyer rose into the cold December air, stayed up for 12 seconds, and covered 120 feet, about the length of a small field. But in those 12 seconds, human history changed forever. When Orville landed, Wilbur ran toward him, laughing and shouting with joy. They hugged each other tightly, both grinning like children. After years of trial, error, and hope, they had done it. A machine heavier than air had flown, under its own power, controlled by a human. They made 3 more flights that same day. Wilbur's last one went 852 feet and stayed in the air for 59 seconds. Each flight was smoother, more confident, more real. Their dream had finally become a truth. Humans could fly. Remember the camera that John Daniels carried? He had snapped it just as the flyer lifted off the ground. That photo, Orville lying on the plane, Wilbur running beside it, became one of the most important pictures ever taken. It showed the exact moment when the impossible became possible. A frozen moment in time that said, "Look, we can fly." After the last flight, the brothers carried the flyer back to camp. The wind picked up suddenly and flipped the plane, damaging it badly. They would never fly it again. But they didn't feel sad, because the dream had already come true. They packed their belongings, took the photo, and went home quietly to Dayton. No one greeted them with fame or parades. Most people didn't even believe their story yet. But history had already changed. The Wright brothers had conquered the sky. After that cold December day in 1903, Wilbur and Orville Wright returned home to Dayton, Ohio, quietly, without any celebration. They had just changed the course of human history, but almost no one believed them. They had written letters and sent reports to newspapers about their successful flight, but editors thought it was a joke. How could 2 bicycle makers from a small town possibly invent a flying machine? Most people ignored the story, and some even laughed. But the brothers didn't care. They knew what they had seen. They had flown, and that was enough to keep them going. Back home, the brothers started improving the flyer. They didn't want to just glide or hop. They wanted to fly longer, smoother, and higher. They began working on Flyer 2 and Flyer 3, making small changes after each test. Each time they fixed one problem, another appeared, but they treated each mistake like a teacher. In 1904, they found a large open field near Huffman Prairie outside Dayton. It was flat and windy, perfect for flying experiments without having to travel all the way back to Kitty Hawk. They built a wooden shed there, set up their new Flyer 2, and started testing again. At first, their flights were short and clumsy, but slowly, little by little, the flights grew longer and steadier. Each time they learned something new about control, balance, and turning in the air. On September 20th, 1904, something extraordinary happened. Wilbur took off, flew around the field, and came back to where he started, making the very first complete circle in the air. It was a short flight, only about a minute and a half, but it proved that they could truly control their airplane, not just glide in a straight line. They had turned flight into something predictable, something that could be practiced, improved, and repeated. They were no longer just inventors. They were pilots. Still, the world didn't believe them. Newspapers continued to doubt their claims. Even scientists said it was impossible. If such a thing had happened, we'd know about it, they said. The Wright brothers didn't argue. They simply went back to work. In 1905, they built Flyer 3, their most advanced airplane yet. It had a stronger engine, better balance, and improved controls. This time, the flights lasted minutes, not seconds. They could fly wherever they wanted in the field, turning, climbing, circling, and landing softly. By October of that year, they could fly for over 30 minutes at a time, covering 24 miles in the air. They had built the world's first practical airplane. But they still had one problem. They couldn't find anyone who believed them enough to invest in their invention. After so many rejections, the brothers decided to keep their work private. They stopped public demonstrations and focused on getting patents, legal protection for their design. They knew their invention was powerful. They wanted to make sure no one stole their ideas before they could prove it to the world. So for almost 3 years, they kept their airplane away from curious eyes.
People began to say the Wright brothers must have given up. But in truth, they were waiting, patiently and quietly, for the right moment. Finally, in 1907, word of their success reached across the ocean. People in France, where many inventors were also trying to fly, grew curious. Some French engineers thought maybe the Wrights were real after all. They invited the brothers to come to Europe and show their airplane. Wilbur went first. He packed up a new version of the Flyer and traveled to France in 1908. When he arrived, people were skeptical. They said, "Show us this miracle machine of yours." Wilbur smiled politely and said, "Very well, let's fly." On August 8, 1908, at a field near Le Mans, France, Wilbur Wright prepared his airplane before a crowd of curious onlookers. Some were engineers, others were military officers, and many were journalists who had come to see if this American really could fly. The engine started with a loud hum. The propellers spun, the plane rolled forward, and then it rose smoothly into the air. The crowd gasped. Wilbur turned, circled, and dipped gracefully, controlling every movement as if the airplane were part of him. When he landed, the entire field erupted in applause. The French newspapers the next morning called it a triumph of science. They wrote, "The Wright brothers have flown, and they have conquered the sky." In one moment, the world's laughter turned into awe. While Wilbur was in France, Orville stayed in the United States to show the U.S. Army what their airplane could do. The military wanted to see if the plane could be useful for carrying messages or scouting from the air. In September 1908, at Fort Myer, Virginia, Orville demonstrated the Flyer before Army officers, reporters, and curious spectators. He flew perfectly, turning and landing smoothly each time. The crowd cheered. But on September 17th, tragedy struck. During a test flight with an Army lieutenant named Thomas Selfridge, one of the propellers broke mid-air. The plane crashed. Orville was badly injured. His leg and ribs were broken.
Lieutenant Selfridge, sadly, became the first person to die in an airplane crash. It was a heartbreaking day. Orville recovered slowly, but the event reminded everyone that flight, while beautiful, could also be dangerous. Still, the Wright brothers didn't stop. They made the airplane safer, stronger, and easier to control. By 1909, the world finally understood. The Wright brothers were not dreamers. They were pioneers. Wilbur continued flying in Europe, showing kings, queens, and scientists the miracle of human flight. Crowds of thousands watched in wonder as his planes circled above. In France, Wilbur was treated like a hero. Children waved flags with his name on them. Newspapers called him the master of the air. Back home, Orville rejoined him after recovering, and together they formed the Wright Company to build airplanes for others. The same two brothers who once repaired bicycles were now teaching the world how to fly. Their father, Bishop Milton Wright, had supported them from the start. He had always told them to work hard, stay honest, and never give up. In 1909, he wrote them a letter that said, "From the beginning I have been with you in spirit. You have not only conquered the air, you have conquered yourselves." When he finally saw his sons fly, tears filled his eyes. He whispered, "I always knew they would." By 1910, airplanes began appearing everywhere, in newspapers, in shows, and in people's dreams. Inventors from all over the world built their own versions, inspired by the Wrights' design. The brothers opened flying schools to train new pilots. They flew across cities, over rivers, and around racetracks. Everywhere they went, people looked up and saw something that had once been impossible: a person flying through the sky. Human flight was no longer a dream. It was real. When Wilbur and Orville Wright proved that human flight was possible, the world quietly stepped into a new age. No longer were the skies a mystery or a dream. They had become a path, open for discovery, invention, and imagination. Before 1903, a journey from New York to Paris would take weeks by ship. After the Wright brothers, that same journey could someday take hours. But at that moment, in the early 1900s, few people truly understood what their invention would mean. They had not just created a machine, they had changed how humans saw the Earth itself. By 1910, Wilbur and Orville had set up flight schools to teach others. One was in Dayton, Ohio, near their family home. Another was in France, where people were eager to learn the secrets of flight. New students arrived every week: soldiers, engineers, adventurers, and dreamers. They stood beside the brothers, nervous and excited, as they watched the machine rise into the air for the first time. The brothers taught them with patience and calm voices. Wilbur often said, "Flying is a matter of balance, like riding a bicycle. Once you find the balance, the sky feels like home." Students learned to handle the levers, to listen to the wind, to trust the wings. Soon, the first generation of pilots took to the air, men who would later inspire the world with courage and discovery. As airplanes became more common, inventors around the world began building their own designs. France, Germany, Britain, and America. Everyone wanted to improve the airplane. Engines became stronger, wings became longer and more stable. Flights that once lasted a minute now lasted an hour. Newspapers started holding air races, where pilots flew from city to city, cheered on by thousands of spectators. People would stop in the streets, look up at the sky and point, "Look, there's a flying machine." Children would run after the shadows of airplanes, and artists would paint them in wonder, symbols of courage, freedom, and human progress. Through all this excitement, Wilbur and Orville stayed close as brothers. They had shared everything since childhood: ideas, hopes, failures, and success. They didn't chase fame. They didn't dress fancy or live like celebrities. They still preferred simple clothes, quiet dinners, and long talks. Whenever people asked how they managed to invent something so incredible, Wilbur would smile and say, "We thought about it together." And Orville would add, "Neither of us could have done it alone." Their partnership was built on trust and love, the kind that made even the hardest days bearable. In 1912, tragedy visited the Wright family once again. Wilbur fell ill while traveling in Europe. He had worked for years without rest, meeting officials, managing the company, and teaching flight. He caught typhoid fever, a disease that was common then, and within days his health worsened. Orville stayed by his side, along with his father and sister Catherine. But, despite every effort, Wilbur passed away on May 30th, 1912, at the age of just 45. Orville was heartbroken. He wrote later, "When Wilbur died, half of me went with him." Without Wilbur, Orville continued their work, but his heart was never quite the same.
Without Wilbur, Orville continued their work, but his heart was never quite the same. After Wilbur's passing, Orville took care of their company and continued to improve their airplanes. He also worked to preserve the memory of what he and his brother had built together. Over the years, Orville became a gentle teacher and mentor to younger inventors and pilots. He often said, "Wilbur and I were lucky to see the dawn of flight, but the next generations will see the sunrise." He continued flying occasionally, testing designs, giving speeches, and sharing stories. When people thanked him for creating airplanes, he always smiled modestly and said, "We were only two brothers who wanted to fly." By the 1920s, airplanes were no longer rare. They had become part of daily life. Mail was being carried through the air. People could travel between cities faster than ever before. Governments began using airplanes for exploration and defense. And new companies, inspired by the Wright brothers, started passenger air travel. For the first time, people could buy tickets to fly across the country. What was once a dream now had schedules, routes, and timetables. The world felt smaller, as if the sky had brought everyone closer. In the 1930s, brave pilots began pushing the limits of what airplanes could do. They flew over oceans, mountains, and deserts, breaking records and setting new ones every year. Names like Charles Lindbergh, Amelia Earhart, and Howard Hughes became famous. They all looked back to the Wright brothers as their heroes, the men who had given wings to the human spirit. When Lindbergh flew solo across the Atlantic Ocean in 1927, he wrote in his diary that he felt Wilbur and Orville were flying beside him. Their influence stretched far beyond their time. It reached into the hearts of everyone who dared to dream of flight. As Orville grew older, he continued to live in Dayton, in the same modest home where his family had once gathered. He never married. His life had always been devoted to invention and discovery. He loved to visit air shows and marvel at the new airplanes being built, sleek metal aircraft, faster and stronger than he and Wilbur had ever imagined. When he saw a giant passenger plane flying across the sky, he once said softly, "Wilbur would have loved this." In 1944, Orville saw the first jet airplane take flight, a machine powered not by propellers, but by jets of fire and air. He was amazed at how far aviation had come. He lived long enough to see humans not only fly across oceans, but plan for the day when they might reach the stars. Orville Wright passed away peacefully in 1948 at the age of 76. He was the last of the two brothers, the last witness of that cold December morning in 1903 when the dream of flight had become real. He left behind no children, but his legacy was carried by millions. Every airplane, every pilot, every journey through the sky, all of it traced back to the small wooden flyer that rose above the sand at Kitty Hawk. When people asked what made them different, their sister Catherine once said, "They never stopped believing that ordinary men could do extraordinary things." Today, more than a century later, every time an airplane takes off, the spirit of Wilbur and Orville Wright takes off with it. The roar of engines, the steady wings slicing through the clouds, the freedom to see the earth from above. All of it began with two brothers in a bicycle shop, who refused to give up. They had no investors, no degrees, no great fortune, only curiosity, courage, and an unbreakable bond. They didn't just invent a machine, they invented a new chapter in the story of humanity. Because of them, the world became connected, families reunited, nations discovered each other, and the dream of flying, once thought impossible, became part of our everyday lives. If there's one thing the Wright brothers taught us, it's this. Dreams don't come true because they're easy. They come true because someone refuses to stop trying. The Wright brothers faced doubt, failure, and ridicule, but they believed in themselves and in each other. And with every screw tightened, every wing tested, every gust of wind faced head-on, they got closer and closer to the sky. The airplane wasn't built overnight. It was built through patience, teamwork, and endless curiosity. And in the end, that's what made it fly. When the Wright brothers first lifted their airplane off the ground in 1903, the world below them was still moving slowly. People traveled by horse, train, or ship. News took days, sometimes weeks, to reach other countries. Distances felt huge, oceans divided nations, and mountains separated lands. But once humans learned to fly, the world started to shrink, not in size, but in time. Journeys that once took weeks could now take days, and later just hours. The airplane changed not only how we move, but how we think about the world. At first, airplanes were seen as toys for inventors or brave daredevils. People watched them in air shows, amazed but unsure what they were truly for. But soon, everyone began to realize this invention was more than a wonder. It was a tool that could connect the world. By the 1910s, mail started flying through the air. Governments began using planes to deliver letters faster than any train. People could send messages from one side of the country to another in just a day. For the first time, the sky became a bridge between people. Then came World War I in 1914, and airplanes were about to face their first great test. When the war began, planes were still simple. Open cockpits, wooden frames, cloth wings. But soon, they were used for scouting, carrying messages, and even fighting. Pilots, called aviators, flew high above the battlefields to watch enemy movements. They took photographs and sent reports back to commanders. Soon, nations began to build fighter planes, small, fast aircraft with guns mounted on them. For the first time in history, battles were fought not just on land or sea, but in the air. It was a strange new world. The airplane had become both a symbol of courage and a weapon of war. But even during that dark time, flight continued to improve. Engines became stronger, wings became more reliable, and pilots learned how to fly higher and faster. When the war ended in 1918, many pilots came home with one dream: to use airplanes not for destruction, but for connection. Some began offering air rides to people who had never flown before. Others started delivering mail between major cities. And a few dreamers began planning the next big thing: passenger air travel. One of those dreamers was a young American pilot named Charles Lindbergh. In 1927, he did something incredible. He flew solo across the Atlantic Ocean from New York to Paris in a single airplane called the Spirit of St. Louis. The world watched in awe. When he landed, crowds of thousands cheered him as a hero.
And in that moment, air travel became a symbol of courage, progress, and peace. After Lindbergh's flight, countries began building airports. Airlines were founded, small at first with just a few planes. But soon, more and more people wanted to experience the magic of flying. By the 1930s, airplanes were becoming safer, faster, and more comfortable. Passengers could sit inside closed cabins instead of open cockpits. There were seats, windows, even meals served in the air. It was the beginning of commercial aviation, the kind of flying we know today. People could now visit faraway relatives, explore their countries, and do business across oceans. The airplane had turned the whole Earth into one connected neighborhood. Flying also helped people discover places that were once unreachable. Scientists and explorers used airplanes to study the North Pole, the Amazon rainforest, and the Sahara Desert. They could map mountains, glaciers, and rivers that had never been seen before. Doctors began flying to remote areas to bring medicine and help where roads could not reach. Planes carried food and supplies to people in need after floods or earthquakes. Flight had become a gift, a way to help others. Then, in 1939, another great war began, World War II. Once again, airplanes took to the skies, but now they were faster, stronger, and more advanced than ever before. There were fighter planes, bombers, and transport aircraft. Some could fly across entire oceans without stopping. For the first time, airplanes played a central role in a global conflict. It was a terrible time, but it also pushed aviation technology forward faster than anyone could have imagined. Jet engines, radar systems, and stronger materials were developed. When the war ended in 1945, those same inventions helped build the foundation for modern air travel. The skies that had once been used for battle would soon become highways of peace. By the 1950s, a new era began. The jet age. Airplanes were no longer made of wood and cloth. They were sleek, silver machines made of metal, powered by roaring jet engines. They could fly higher than the clouds and cross oceans in just hours. For the first time, ordinary people could travel across the world. Families could live on one continent and visit relatives on another. Students could study abroad, and businesses could operate globally. Air travel had become the heartbeat of modern life. If Wilbur and Orville could have seen it, they would have smiled. Their small wooden flyer had given birth to a world that could soar. Today, airplanes touch every part of human life. They deliver food, medicine, and mail. They help in emergencies, carry doctors to remote islands, and transport organs for life-saving surgeries. They bring tourists to see the wonders of the world, from the pyramids to the northern lights. They carry families to reunite and dreamers to new beginnings. Every minute, thousands of airplanes fly across the sky, each one following invisible paths drawn by technology, paths that all lead back to Kitty Hawk. The airplane also changed the way people think about the world. It made us realize that we are all closer than we imagined. A child in Africa could someday visit a city in America. A scientist in Japan could share ideas with one in Germany. A student in Pakistan could study in Canada and be home in less than a day. The world became a shared sky, a place where boundaries faded and humanity felt more connected than ever before. If you've ever looked out of an airplane window, you know the feeling. The clouds look like mountains of cotton. The rivers below twist like silver ribbons. Cities sparkle like tiny constellations. It's peaceful and humbling to see the world from above, to realize how small yet connected we all are. That view, that feeling of awe, exists because two brothers once looked at a toy helicopter in their living room and thought, we can make one big enough to carry us. Today, flight is no longer a miracle. It's part of life. But every airplane that lifts off carries the same spirit that Wilbur and Orville had, a spirit of curiosity, courage, and wonder. From massive passenger jets to tiny paper planes, from rockets soaring into space to drones exploring Mars. It all began with one small wooden machine and two brothers who refused to give up. They opened the sky, and now it belongs to everyone. When Wilbur and Orville Wright built their little wooden airplane in 1903, they could have never imagined how far their idea would go. Their first flight lasted only 12 seconds, but that tiny moment opened the door to the entire universe. Because once humans learned how to control the sky, they began to ask a bigger question. If we can fly through the air, can we fly beyond it? That single question led humanity from soft sand dunes at Kitty Hawk to the silent emptiness of space. After the Wright brothers, airplanes kept improving every year. Inventors and engineers built new designs, some with stronger engines, some that could carry more people, and some that could fly higher than ever before. By the 1930s and 40s, airplanes were made of metal. Their wings no longer stretched with cloth, but shaped with steel and aluminum. Engines grew more powerful, and propellers gave way to jets that roared like thunder. Airplanes could now fly above the clouds, where the sky turned dark blue and the earth curved gently below. Pilots began to feel something new. They were no longer just flying over the world. They were flying around it. And that simple truth sparked humanity's next great dream: to leave the world behind and reach for the stars.
For centuries, people had looked up at the night sky with wonder. They saw the moon glowing, stars twinkling, planets shining, and they imagined what it would be like to visit them. But before the Wright brothers, such dreams were impossible. No one even knew how to stay in the air, let alone travel beyond it. The invention of the airplane changed that forever. It proved that with patience, courage, and knowledge, humans could defy gravity and explore new frontiers. Scientists began asking, if wings can lift us through the air, what kind of power could lift us beyond it? In the early 1900s, while the Wright brothers were perfecting flight, a few dreamers were quietly studying a different kind of flight, one that didn't rely on air at all. One of them was Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, a Russian schoolteacher. He believed that rockets could someday carry people into space. He wrote, "Earth is the cradle of humanity, but one cannot live in the cradle forever." At the same time, another scientist, Robert Goddard in America, was building real rockets in his backyard. He read about the Wright brothers and believed that their success was only the first step towards something far greater. In 1926, Goddard launched the world's first liquid-fueled rocket. It flew only 41 feet high, but just like the Wright brothers' 12-second flight, it was the beginning of a new era. As airplanes improved during the 1940s, so did rockets. They were used during World War II, but soon after the war, scientists began to dream of using them not as weapons, but as vehicles of discovery. The same spirit that drove Wilbur and Orville now lived in a new generation of engineers. They asked themselves, if a plane can circle the Earth, why not build a rocket that can leave it? By the 1950s, two powerful nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, began what was called the space race. Each wanted to be the first to explore beyond Earth's sky. And in this race, every rocket carried a little bit of the Wright brothers' legacy, because every flight, every launch, stood on the foundation they had built. In 1969, only 66 years after the Wright brothers' first flight, another machine, bigger, louder, and far more powerful, carried 3 astronauts toward the moon. The mission was called Apollo 11. When the spacecraft landed on the moon's dusty surface, astronaut Neil Armstrong stepped out and said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." If Wilbur and Orville could have seen it, they would have recognized something familiar: the courage to do what had never been done before. Their fragile wooden plane had led, step by step, to a machine that could cross the emptiness of space. After the moon landing, the dream of flight kept growing. Airplanes became faster, stronger, and safer. Rockets grew larger and smarter. By the 1980s, humans had built space shuttles, airplane-like spacecraft that could fly into orbit,
carry astronauts and satellites, and then glide back to Earth for reuse. It was like a circle completing itself, from the first fragile flyer of 1903 to a machine that could leave Earth and return again. Each flight whispered the same message: we can go farther. Even today, every new flying machine still carries a touch of the Wright brothers' spirit. When engineers design airplanes, they still study lift, drag, and balance, the same things Wilbur and Orville tested with their gliders. When astronauts train for space missions, they learn to control pitch, yaw, and roll, movements first discovered by the Wrights in their 1902 glider. Their simple discoveries became the foundation for everything that flies, from jumbo jets to rockets, from drones to Mars rovers. Without the Wright brothers, humanity might still be looking up at the sky, wondering what it feels like to fly. Flight didn't stop at the moon. Humans sent probes to Mars, Jupiter, and beyond. We built telescopes that orbit the Earth, and space stations where astronauts live for months at a time. We now explore the edges of our solar system, and some of our machines have already left it, sailing endlessly through the stars. But every journey upward, every rocket, every spaceship, every dream of the cosmos can trace its roots back to a single idea born in a small workshop in Dayton, Ohio. Two brothers, a bicycle shop, a few pieces of wood, and a belief that the sky is not the limit. The story of the Wright brothers reminds us that every great achievement starts small. Their first flight was short, but their impact was endless. They didn't wait for perfect conditions. They didn't have much money. They didn't even have formal training. But they had something greater: curiosity and courage. Because of that, we now live in a world where airplanes cross oceans and rockets cross galaxies. And maybe one day, when humans fly to another planet, someone will look out of their spaceship window and whisper a quiet thank you to the two brothers who first believed we could fly. More than 100 years have passed since that cold, windy morning in 1903 when Wilbur and Orville Wright lifted their small airplane into the air at Kitty Hawk. Only a few people stood on the sand dunes that day. The flight lasted 12 seconds. It covered just 120 feet. But in that tiny moment, the world changed forever. From that single leap into the wind came every airplane, every jet, every rocket, and every dream that has since touched the sky. The brothers didn't just build a machine, they built a bridge between Earth and the heavens. Because of their courage, the sky, once a distant ceiling, became a road we could travel. Every sunrise flight, every airplane window view, every cloud we sail above exists because two ordinary men believed they could do something extraordinary. Before the Wright brothers, the sky belonged only to birds, wind, and imagination. After them, it belonged to everyone. And still, more than a century later, we still carry that same feeling of wonder every time we see a plane climb into the air. That soft, rising hum that reminds us how far the human spirit can go when it refuses to stay grounded. The Wright brothers were not rich or powerful. They didn't have a team of hundreds or a laboratory filled with machines. They had a workbench, a few hand tools, and a shared dream. That's what makes their story so powerful. It reminds us that the future doesn't belong to those who have the most. It belongs to those who believe the most. They believed in testing, failing, learning, and trying again. They believed that one day the wind would lift them. And it did. Their story isn't just about flight. It's about faith, persistence, and the quiet bravery of never giving up. There's a lesson in every turn of their propeller, in every note from their diaries, and in every grain of sand that brushed their faces at Kitty Hawk. It's this: dreams are built one small step at a time. When things didn't work, they didn't quit. When the wind knocked them down, they stood back up. When people laughed, they smiled and went back to work. That is why the airplane flies, not because of engines or wings, but because of determination, because of hearts that refused to stop trying. Flight didn't just change how we move, it changed how we see. From the sky, the earth looks peaceful. No borders, no divisions. Mountains melt into valleys, rivers curve like silver threads, and cities glow like small stars against the darkness. The airplane taught humanity humility. It reminded us that we all share one planet, one home. When you look down from above, you realize how connected everything truly is. Perhaps that is the greatest gift the Wright brothers gave us, the gift of perspective. They helped us see our world not from the ground, but from the sky. And with that, they helped us understand how fragile and beautiful it is. To fly is to be free. It's the feeling of leaving behind gravity, fear, and doubt, the same feeling the Wright brothers must have felt as their glider lifted off the dunes for the first time. Flight has always been a symbol of freedom and hope. It means that limits can be broken, that dreams can be reached, and that no matter how impossible something seems, it might just take one more try to make it real. That's why we still look up when a plane passes by. Somewhere deep inside, we all remember that first flight and what it meant for humanity to rise. The Wright brothers never sought fame or glory. They worked quietly, trusting that the truth of their work would speak louder than any newspaper headline. They were guided by something invisible, not just the wind beneath their wings, but the faith that the wind would hold them. That unseen force, the wind that carried their small flyer, is the same invisible hope that carries every dreamer today. The same wind that once pushed against their wings now fills the sails of every aircraft, rocket, and imagination across the planet. If we draw a line through history, we can see where their invention has taken us. From the Wright Flyer to the jet plane. From the jet plane to the space shuttle. From the space shuttle to the Mars rover. And beyond, to the stars we haven't yet reached.
Every takeoff, every landing, every exploration is part of the same story that began with two brothers and a dream. It's a story of motion, of discovery, and of the endless hunger humans have to go farther. In museums around the world, pieces of the original Wright Flyer are carefully preserved: faded cloth, worn wood, and the mark of human hands. To some, they look like old relics, but to those who know the story, they are sacred, symbols of courage, simplicity, and genius. At the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., the Flyer rests under soft lights, and people from all nations walk quietly around it, looking up in awe. Children press their faces against the glass and whisper, "Did that really fly?" And their parents smile and say, "Yes, that's where it all began." Today, the sound of an airplane in the distance is so common we hardly notice it. But imagine for a moment what it must have been like in 1903, to hear that first wooden frame rise into the wind, to see it move through the air, alive and real. That sound, the hum of discovery, still echoes through every sky today. Every jet engine, every propeller, every rocket's roar, it all carries the same melody, a song that says, "We can." The Wright brothers' invention was more than an achievement. It was a promise that no dream is too high, that even ordinary people, with patience, courage, and love for what they do, can change the world. That promise lives on in every pilot, every astronaut, every child who folds a paper plane and throws it toward the ceiling, hoping it will soar. Because in that small act, in that playful launch, is the same wonder that once filled a workshop in Dayton, Ohio. Now, more than a century later, humans are building planes that fly themselves, rockets that return to land, and spacecraft that will carry people to Mars. Every new step forward is a continuation of the Wright brothers' story, a story that never really ends. Because the dream of flight is not just about leaving the ground, it's about lifting the human spirit. And as long as there are people who dream of going farther, the Wright brothers' legacy will live on. In the end, their message is simple, and it still speaks to us today. The sky has no end, only beginnings. Every dawn when the first airplane streaks across the golden light, the world is reminded of that truth. We may never know how far flight will take us, perhaps one day to other planets, perhaps even beyond the stars, but one thing will always remain the same: the courage it took to start. So when you look up and see a plane cutting across the blue, remember two brothers, Wilbur and Orville, who once stood on a windy beach with a dream as fragile as the wings they built. They faced the wind, they trusted their craft, and they took a leap of faith. And because they did, the whole world learned to fly.